Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hamza Al-Budali. I'm the co-president of the Muslim Student Union at Stanford, and I'll be introducing our esteemed guest speaker, Ustad Adnan Rashid. But before I do that, I just want to give a brief description of this event and of why we're here today. So the title of the event is Islam in South Asia, an Introduction to Mughal History. And this event is part of a larger series of events that some of us at the MSU have been working on called Islamic History, Discovering Our Roots. And the purpose of this series is first to increase the knowledge of Muslims, especially young Muslims, of the fascinating history of Islam and of our collective civilization as an ummah, as a community of believers. And the second purpose is to connect us to our intellectual and cultural heritage so that we can actually identify with this history as our own. Because if you're like me growing up in the West, you probably didn't have a lot of opportunities to learn about Islamic history. And most of what you did read or hear through books, media, Hollywood is probably negative. Even if you take classes at a Western university like Stanford, what you'll learn will be from a Western or secular or Orientalist worldview, which of course can be very biased. So in this series, we're specifically inviting Muslim speakers who've studied both history and Islam, so they can give us a more authentic picture of our history from an Islamic paradigm. And inshallah, the plan is to focus on a different region of the Muslim world each time. Last quarter, we did African history. Today, Sheikh Adnan will be giving a lecture on Mughal history. And so who is Sheikh Adnan? Adnan Rashid is an international lecturer from London, UK, who specializes in Muslim history and Islamic numismatics, which is the study of coins. He attained his BA with honors from Birkbeck College at the University of London and completed his master's from the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's currently pursuing further studies in history, and he has studied Hadith sciences and holds ijazah certificates in that field. He has also debated high-profile Christian theologians and appears occasionally on major media outlets such as BBC, Islam Channel, ITV, etc. Adnan Rashid has traveled extensively and has conducted history tours to a number of Islamic monuments. He's an avid book collector and takes a keen interest in studying ancient and medieval coins. He's taught many Islamic as well as history courses and workshops around the globe. And Adnan Rashid is currently working on a book on the history of Muslim civilization. And he also writes poetry in the Urdu language occasionally and is an admirer of poets like Mir Ghalib and Iqbal. And Adnan Rashid is deeply fascinated by the legacies of men such as Shah Wali Allah and Tipu Sultan. And he currently resides with his family in London. MashaAllah. So the plan is Sheikh Adnan will lecture for about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. So if you're ready, Sheikh Adnan, you can take it away.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah ma ba'd. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سيروا في الأرض فانظروا كيف كان عاقبة المكذبين. صدق الله العظيم. Respected brothers and sisters in Islam, I am honored. I am very, very pleased to be with you today. It is an absolute source of pleasure for myself to deliver a lecture on this important topic, Islam in South Asia in general and the Mughal history in particular. I will start with a very brief general introduction to Islam in South Asia. And bear in mind, this is going to be a very brief introduction. And then we will move on to the Mughal history. And I will also be talking about Mughal period. And the lecture will be very brief again. It will be an introduction to Mughal history. For lengthier studies, for detailed studies, I will be recommending some books in due course. So how did Islam come to South Asia? What we today know as the Indian subcontinent. Islam came in a number of ways to South Asia. Many Muslim traders came to the southwestern coast of India, and they inhabited that place for a very long time, mostly Yemeni traders. Militarily speaking, the Muslims appeared in the Indian subcontinent on a significant scale in the latter part of the 7th century. We're talking about in Hijri year, we're talking about 92 Hijri, and in Common Era year or Gregorian calendar, we're talking about 711 CE, exactly the same year when Tariq bin Ziyad landed in Spain, when Qutayba bin Muslim was taking land near northern China. Here we have a general called Muhammad bin Qasim, a young man, a teenager. Sources tell us he was about 17 years old when his uncle called Hajjaj bin Yusuf, who was the governor of Iraq on the part of the Umayyads. He was the Umayyad governor of Iraq. He sent an expedition of 5,000 men to the province of Sindh. Sindh was a province of the Indian subcontinent at the time, and it was governed by a Hindu king. And cut the long story short, Muhammad bin Qasim with his 5,000 fighters landed in Sindh, near current-day Karachi, the city of Karachi in Pakistan, and he made an incursion towards the capital of Raja Dahir, the ruler of this region. Now, there are many reasons as to why this expedition took place in the first place. Many historians have put it down to a kidnapping of Muslim merchants who were traveling via sea, and some of the pirates had kidnapped these Muslim merchants, and some of them managed to get their message across to Hajjaj bin Yusuf. And as a retaliation, as a response to these pleas for mercy or for help, Hajjaj bin Yusuf sent this expedition. How authentic are these reports is a very good question. No one knows. Okay, there is no reason to believe that they are authentic, or there is no reason to reject them. So we leave them in the these authentic these sources are there. We can choose to believe them, or we can easily choose to leave them. So Muhammad bin Qasim came in. Cut the long story short, there's no doubt, all historians are unanimous, that an Arab expedition took place into the province of Sindh, and this was the first military incursion of any significance within the Indian subcontinent that took place in the year 711 CE and 92 Hijri. And Muhammad bin Qasim, and this is, bear in mind, this is the time of the Tabi'een and the Sahaba. Some of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad are still alive. For example, Anas bin Malik was alive when this expedition took place. Anas bin Malik was a very important companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who had delivered many reports from the Prophet to his students, his followers. So this was the time of the Tabi'een, when the students of the Sahaba were alive in abundance. It may well be the case that Muhammad bin Qasim might have met some companions of the Prophet or some Tabi'een easily. So he came with this army of 5,000 men. He took the land of Sindh by storm. Raja Dahir was defeated in battle, and the province of Sindh succumbed to Muslim military incursion. And thenceforth, Muslims governed Sindh for nearly 3 centuries. The history is far too vast for me to cover in a short lecture like this. This is only an introduction, how Muslims actually appeared, militarily speaking, in the Indian subcontinent. So the first incursion into the Indian subcontinent took place from, let's say, southwest of the Indian, or maybe western part of the continent at the time, which was governed by a man called Raja Dahir. So this was about it. Many Umayyad governors came to rule the province of Sindh. Then later on, the Umayyads lost their power, their influence. The Abbasids launched another incursion into the land of Sindh, and they took the land of Sindh. And then Arabs governed parts of Sindh for nearly 300 years. And that's about it. This is how far Muslims went for nearly 3 centuries. Then almost 400 years later, after the Prophet's death, we're talking about, let's say, the 11th century CE, when from the north, from the city of Ghazni, another invader or another adventurer, depending on perspectives, right? If you were to read some of the Hindu nationalist narratives today in India, Mahmud Ghaznavid was simply an invader, an unwanted, uninvited invader. From the other side, if you were to read traditional Muslim narratives, he was a hero of Islam who came to defeat disbelief in India, right? Both these perspectives can be questioned as far as historians are concerned. Historians don't see things in black and white like that. Rather, historians look for nuances as to why these invasions were taking place in the first place, right? So from the north, we had Mahmud Ghaznavi from the city of Ghazna in current-day Afghanistan. This basically dynasty was formed by the father of Mahmud. His name was Sabuktagin, who was a Turkic slave. Okay, and this slave dynasty came about as a result of the fall of another dynasty called the Samanids. Samanids were the clients of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. So Samanids declared independence later on, as far as political independence was concerned, and militarily Samanids became independent. Then an offshoot of Samanids was basically these Turkic slaves who came to rule some parts of Afghanistan and current-day Persia or Iran, right? This was a huge power ruled by Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi. Mahmud invaded India nearly 17 times to accumulate wealth because he had heard about temples in India, in current-day Gujarat, filled with gold and silver, because the Hindus had this tradition of donating gold and silver to temples. So the temples were a very attractive, how can I put it, prize for invaders. And Mahmud had heard about these temples. So to simply accumulate wealth like any other king would do in India, there were many kings at the time, Hindu kings, invading other Hindu territories doing the same thing. So anyone who found gold in temples, let's say, or silver or anything valuable, that temple would be a prize to win for any invader. So Richard Eaton, in his book, India in the Persianate Age, talks about it. In the very beginning of the book, he talks about how Hindu kings were invading other Hindu territories to accumulate wealth and defeat other Hindu kings, and temples became the target of these invasions very often. So my brothers and sisters, this is how the second entry into India took place from the north, as far as the Muslims are concerned. So Mahmud was not interested, Mahmud of Ghazna, or also known as Mahmud al-Ghaznavi, he was not interested in establishing a stronghold in the Indian subcontinent. So he came in, he basically took a lot of gold and silver, he looted temples, and he went back to Ghazna. And he became very powerful as a result. Gold and silver was in abundance as far as Mahmud's court was concerned. Mahmud, he patronized many scholars and poets in Ghazni. As a result, one famous Persian poet who flourished in the court of Mahmud al-Ghaznavi was Ferdowsi, the author of the famous Shahnameh, an epic poem which describes legendary Persian history, talking about many imagined Persian heroes. And that was the birth of Persian poetry, the classical Persian poetry we know today, right? So Ferdowsi was working in the court of Mahmud, and he had dedicated Shahnameh or Shahnama of Ferdowsi to Mahmud, the ruler at the time. Also, Abu Rayhan al-Bayruni was another scholar who was working in the court of Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, who wrote first extensive social study or socio-cultural study of India. And his book was called Kitabul Hind, literally translated as the Book of India. So Abu Rayhan al-Bayruni, he observed many things in India. He came into India, he observed the Hindu religion, he observed the culture, he observed politics in India at the time, and he gathered information. It was like an intelligence report for the king of Ghazni, Mahmud. And that book is a fascinating piece of work, which is nearly 1,000 years old. And the sheer detail and the accuracy of this work is very much appreciated by the students of Indian history and the scholars who study Indian history. So Mahmud's invasions were the second military incursion within India from the northern territory. But Mahmud did not establish a stronghold, and he went back. So the first stronghold from the north, we can say, was the city of Lahore. And this happened in the 11th century. This happened in the 11th century CE. If you have any questions, brothers and sisters, please post them so that they can be put to me later on, and I will do my best to answer them, inshallah. So after Mahmud, Ghaznavi had come and gone in the 13th century, or the late 12th century to be precise. The late 12th century, another invader or adventurer from the current day Afghanistan or Afghan territory came into India, invading northern India. And again, cut the long story short, this is an introduction because I want to get to Mughals very quickly, but I want to give you some brief background to the rise of the Mughals so that you understand why we're talking about the Mughals in the first place, right? So Shihabuddin Ghori was the man, or Muizzuddin Muhammad bin Sam Ghori, also known as Shihabuddin Ghori, was the man who invaded India, and a famous battle took place in the year 1192 when at the same time, remember, Sultan Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was fighting the Crusaders in the Holy Land, right? Sultan Salahuddin had defeated the Crusaders in 1187, July 1187, in a place called Hittim. And Shihabuddin Muhammad bin Sam Ghori, Sultan Muizzuddin, he's known by many different names, and his coins can be found even to this day scattered all over Afghanistan and northern India, right? Very powerful man, contemporary of Sultan Salahuddin. He came into India, and in 1192, he defeated a very powerful Hindu king who governed northern India at the time, and his name was Prithvi Raj Jahan. He was defeated in battle, and first battle, there was another battle that took place previously. In this battle, Shihabuddin Muhammad Ghori was defeated by Prithvi Raj Chauhan, but he let him go. Ghori came back the second time in 1192 and defeated Chauhan in the Battle of Tarain, a very famous battle. And thenceforth, he established a stronghold in northern India. This was the first time when Muslims established a very, very, very strong powerhouse in India. And that powerhouse was later on known as the city of Delhi. Delhi was the capital of Muslim power in northern India for another 5 centuries to come. Please bear in mind, remember this part. Another 5 centuries to come, Muslims governed from the city of Delhi with immense power and glory, right? And the city of Delhi was made the capital. Muhammad Ghori was on his way back to Afghanistan, to the territory he came from. He was assassinated in his tent in the year 1206. He was assassinated in current day Pakistan near the city of Jhelum. And then after him came to power his slave called Qutbuddin Aibak. Aibak was a slave bought from Central Asian slave markets. He served his master well, and after the death or the assassination of his master, Qutbuddin Aibak came to power. And it was Qutbuddin Aibak who established the dynasty that came to be known later on as the Delhi Sultanate, the very famous Delhi Sultanate, which was also known as the slave dynasty of India. Remember, brothers and sisters in Islam, my brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends who are listening to this lecture, you may be a Muslim, you may be a non-Muslim. I hope I will present this history in an objective way so that you can all enjoy this talk and take knowledge from it. So, Qutbuddin Aibak, who had succeeded his master as the Sultan, as the ruler, established this dynasty called the slave dynasty of Delhi. So at that time, there were 2 slave dynasties in the Muslim world. One was in Egypt, also called the Mamluk dynasty, literally meaning the owned ones or the possessed ones, because they were also slaves. And then the slave dynasty of India, which was established by powerful slaves who became generals, and then they became the sultans themselves. So the slave dynasty lasted for nearly 300 years afterwards, after Qutbuddin Aibak ruled or established this dynasty. So Qutbuddin Aibak established a powerhouse in Delhi and in Lahore. Again, 4 years later, having established a stronghold in northern India, Qutbuddin Aibak, while he was playing the equivalent of polo in those days, he fell from his horse and he died in Lahore, the city of Lahore in current-day Pakistan, and he's buried to this day in Lahore, near a place called Anarkali. So after he died, a very powerful sultan came to power. His name was Iltutmish, Sultan Shamsuddin Iltutmish. He came to power, and he was a very, very pious, moral, upright character. And he was also a slave. He belonged to the slave class. He belonged to Sultan Ghori as a slave, because he had many slaves. So after Qutbuddin Aibak passed away, Iltutmish, who was another slave, succeeded. And it was at this time when Iltutmish was in power, because he came to power in 1210 CE, 1210, and he governed until 1236. So that's nearly 26 years, right? It was at this time when the Mongol invasions started. It was in 1219 when Genghis Khan, he invaded northeastern territory of the Muslim Empire, ruled by at that time Khwarizm Shah, Muhammad bin Takash Khwarizm Shah, who was the ruler at the time, and Genghis Khan immediately devastated this Khwarizmite empire, and as a result, from Central Asia, there were hundreds of thousands of people who emigrated to either Persia or Afghanistan and further down to India. So Delhi at that time, although was a stronghold of the slave kings rather, a lot of these immigrants running away or taking refuge in other lands coming from Central Asia, they took refuge in the city of Delhi. So the cream of the crop, so to say, from Central Asia ended up in Delhi. Many scholars, many poets, intellectuals, architects, artisans, calligraphers, book producers, you name it, they came to Delhi. And immediately Delhi's economy boomed. Delhi became a hub of civilization. Delhi became a powerhouse in the real sense of the word. Delhi became one of the most powerful, one of the most bustling cities in the world, one of the busiest places in the world, because of the Mongol invasions. So that gave a lot of confidence to the rulers of Delhi, and they started to repel Mongol invasions, because the Mongols also invaded India at this time. So after Iltutmish, another very powerful sultan came to power. Of course, there were minor kings, minor sultans who came to power, not for very long. They were important, of course, because they ruled, but their contribution was not significant enough for us to discuss in a short lecture like that. Of course, they're important historically speaking, like Radia Sultana was the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish, the first woman, the first Muslim woman to rule India was Radia Sultana. She ruled India, or northern India to be precise, for about 4 years. She was the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish, and after her, her brothers came to power, and they were not very effective rulers. And then another slave came to power. His name was Sultan Riyasuddin Balban, who was also Turkic in origin, and he governed with an iron fist, and he repelled Mongol invasions. So, brothers and sisters, cut the long story short, I want to move quickly on to Mughals, because you may be waiting for me to talk about Mughals, and time is flying. So this slave dynasty repelled Mongol invasions, and after Balban came another dynasty, which was also a slave dynasty, but it had a different name. They were the Khiljis. After the Khiljis came Tughlaqs. After the Tughlaqs came Sayyids, and then the Lodhis. And Lodhis were the people who also belonged to the slave dynasty system or that period, the historians relegate this dynasty, the Lodi dynasty, to the slave dynasty period for the reasons of, convenience or accuracy, you name it, it's all there. So who were the Mughals and why are the Mughals so important? Why do we need to talk about Mughals? So slave dynasty with different names, with different individuals from different clans, lasted for nearly 300 years, from the year 1200 to 1500. And I have basically skipped a lot of important details, a lot of important things. For example, one of the things I have skipped is the invasion of India by Timurlane or Timur the Lame, who was a Central Asian adventurer, very similar to Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan and the Mongols having devastated land from northern China all the way to Syria. People thought, okay, this is never going to happen again because it was so bad. But then again, in the 14th century, another Central Asian adventurer arose whose father was a recent convert to Islam, and Timur also was a nominal Muslim, right? He started to take this territory again, and he wanted to revive the legacy of Genghis Khan again. He wanted to be another Genghis Khan. So he went conquering as far as Syria. He also came to India in 1398. In the year 1398, he devastated the city of Delhi, completely destroyed it, razed it to the ground, and went back to Central Asia where he came from. So Timur the Lame, who was also a Turkic ruler, had some Mongol links. He was from a distant Mongol clan, and he was a Central Asian ruler. So he went. But from his children, because the Timurids, after taking a lot of this land, they continued to govern like the Mongols did before them. They continued to govern parts of Central Asia. And after Timur had passed away, nearly 100 years after him, his grandchildren came to govern due to the reasons of inheritance being distributed among many of his children. So many small principalities in Central Asia came about. One of those principalities was the Farghana Valley, okay, where the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara were situated at the time. The Farghana Valley was basically governed by a clan that belonged to the Timurids, and they claimed direct descent from Timurlane or Timur the Lame, which is the name he's known by. He was a great conqueror, great in the sense of the magnitude, not necessarily due to his deeds, but the magnitude was huge. That's why he's called Timurlane the Great. Just like Alexander is called Alexander the Great, okay? Whether he was great morally, ethically, whether he did good things, great things in that sense is a good question. But he was great in terms of magnitude, the magnitude of his conquests. They were absolutely phenomenal. Likewise, Timurlane or Timur the Lame was a very big conqueror in Central Asia. So from his descendants came this man called Sheikh Umar, who had inherited this small principality called Farghana. Sheikh Umar had a son called Babur. His name was Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur. Okay, these people, they followed a mixture of Islamic principles, Persian tradition or culture, and also some of the Mongol values. So these people were Persianized, Central Asian, semi-Mongol, semi-Timurid or Turkic people. They were a mixture of many different cultures and ideas. So the Timurids, and to be precise, Muhammad Babur, who was a young man at the time when he inherited the state from his ancestors, he was a very young man. He could not defend his state against his rivals, who were also claiming this territory from Babur. So Babur, having inherited from his father and from his predecessors, tried to defend the Valley of Farghana from rival clans who eventually defeated Babur, and Babur had to leave his territory for Afghanistan. So Babur started looking for land elsewhere because he could not simply defeat his rivals in Central Asia. So he had to leave the valley of Fergana, which he missed very much. The details, again, are far too many for me to indulge at this stage. So Babur, who was an adventurer, who had an army backing him, he had a band of followers, so he needed territory. He was a young man, an ambitious young man. For him to get the territory, he invaded northern Afghanistan. And when he did that, he took the city of Kabul successfully, and he came to rule the city of Kabul with some trouble. There was a lot of trouble. At that time, India was governed by the remnants of the slave dynasty I've already talked about. And this particular clan was also originally from Afghanistan, or the land of Afghanistan today, and they were called the Lodhis. The Lodhis were governing at the time. There were a few rulers from this dynasty who came to govern, and the Lodhis governed for nearly 50 years. Rulers were like Sikandar Lodhi, Ibrahim Lodhi, and Babur basically came to confront one of the Lodhi rulers, right? So basically some of the Indians invited Babur. Some of the Hindus, merchants, they went to see Babur in Kabul, and they invited him to invade India so that they can be liberated from the Lodhis. So Babur, who was already an adventurer, who was ambitious, an ambitious young man, he saw his opportunity to make a living out of India. So he invaded India. Cut the long story short, again, he was vastly outnumbered, significantly outnumbered in the first battle of Panipat, which took place in the year 1526. It was the year 1526 when Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, the first Mughal emperor, fought another Muslim ruler of northern India called Ibrahim Lodhi at the time, right? A battle took place in this place near Delhi, the city of Delhi. The battlefield was called Panipat because it was close to a spot or a village or a town called Panipat. And the battle took place, and Babur, due to some tactical advantages he defeated his enemy. And there were, of course, a lot of differences among the generals who were representing the Lodi state at the time. Babur took full advantage of that, and he managed to defeat the Lodi king and managed to capture Delhi. And after Delhi, he captured many other northern Indian cities from the Lodi dynasty, including Agra, where the treasure was. So Babur overnight, from an adventurer, from an impoverished ruler of a small principality in Afghanistan called Kabul, he became a powerhouse in himself. And immediately he realized that he has become someone very, very important, because India at the time was extremely rich. India has always been rich. India was always rich until the colonial powers later on bled it dry. India was the richest land in the world, as I will talk about very quickly, inshallah. So Babur, having taken much of northern India in the Lodhis, he started to consolidate his power. He appointed generals, he appointed governors in different cities. And at the same time, Babur started to write his personal memoir called Baburnama, which is a very, very interesting read. It was written in the Turkish language. The Mughals, who were originally a Turkic people, who were Timurids, of course, and the Mughals, by the way, always referred to them as the Timurids. It was only later on, let's say in the 18th century, when the term Mughal was applied against the Mughals, possibly by the British at the time, the East India Company writers or authors in the 18th century, they started to call the Mughals Mughals. The Mughals always took pride in calling themselves the Timurids. They never called themselves the Mughals, because the word Mughal is a Persianized corruption of the word Mongol. Mongol and Mughal, you can see the similarity there. But the Mughals were not necessarily, strictly speaking, Mongol. They were Timurids. They were the children of Timur the Lame, and they drew inspiration from Timurid and, of course, from Babur who was one of his great-grandchildren. So Babur, having consolidated his power, he started to build gardens. He started to miss the cold and the clean weather of Kabul and the valley of Fargana. He was missing Samarkand and Bukhara. Because he was new to India, he was an outsider. He came from outside. He didn't like India much because of the heat, because of the dust. And he talks about it in his personal memoir, Baburnama. So it was written in the Turkish language. It was translated. There are many English translations available of Baburnama today. If I'm not mistaken, one has been published by the Penguin Press. It's a great translation with a good introduction. I strongly recommend that particular memoir if you really want to get into the mind of the first Mughal emperor, who was an intellectual, who was a poet par excellence, who was a great author, a great adventurer, not necessarily a great human being, because I'm not claiming that he was perfect, but he was an intellectual, and he committed many atrocities as well, unfortunately, because again, he was inspired by Timur the Lame, or Timurlane, who was inspired by Genghis Khan. So the tradition of Genghis Khan trickled down to Timurlane, and from Timurlane, that inspiration came to Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, who committed some atrocities. Again, Babur only governed for 4 years, and he fell ill fatally and died in 1530 as a young man. He died in his 40s. He was not very old, and he left behind his son, Humayun. Humayun was a very interesting figure who happened to be, again, an intellectual, and he ruled for nearly 10 years. And after ruling for 10 years, another dynasty came to remove him from power. And these were again Afghans who had come from Afghanistan, and they were brought by the Lodhis before the Mughals, and they were basically working for the Lodhis. So this Afghan clan was led by a man called Farid Khan. His name was Farid Khan, also famously known as Sher Shah, the Lion King. The Lion King, Sher Shah literally translated means the Lion King. This was the title he was given because of his valor in war, his leadership skills, his qualities, his characteristics as a strategist. And he successfully removed Humayun from power, and Humayun went into exile to Persia. And apparently at that time, this was the end of the Mughal Empire. The Mughals had fallen as soon as they had risen. I hope I'm making sense. This is very, very interesting. The history is getting very interesting. So the Mughals almost never came back, or the Mughals almost never had India. What happened later on, all the magnificence of the Mughals, all the achievements almost never happened, because as soon as Mughals took power in India, when Babur had taken India and then his son came to rule for nearly 10 years, they lost power. One of the generals from Bihar, the city of, or the land of Bihar, who was an Afghan, Sher Shah, ousted the emperor, Humayun. So Humayun had to literally run for his life and take refuge with the Safavids in Persia. So the Safavids kept Humayun for nearly 10 years in Persia, right? So in these coming 10 to 15 years, another dynasty was formed called the Suri dynasty, initiated or established by this man called Sher Shah, the Lion King, also known as Sher Shah Suri, a very, very powerful king, a very able ruler. He governed for the next 6 to 7 years almost, and he did many, many great things. He built roads, he built, when it comes to infrastructure, he did some magnificent work within his 5 years tenure. So there are rulers in the history of Islam, or in the history of humanity for that matter, who ruled for very short time, but they left a huge mark on human mind. One of them was, of course, a man called Umar bin Abdulaziz, specifically talking about the Muslim history, who only governed for 2 years, but he left a huge impact on Muslim psyche. His reign lasted for literally 2 years, from 99 Hijri to 101. And the only year he governed, completely speaking, completely, was the year 100 Hijri, right? But he left a huge impact on Muslim psyche. Muslims love him for his 2 years tenure. Allahu Akbar. Likewise, Sher Shah Suri was another example who governed for 6 to 7 years in India. And he ruled from 1539 to 1546, if I'm not mistaken. And this is when he was killed in a battle when he was trying to take a very difficult fortress in India. And gunpowder reserves, or the stock or the storage of gunpowder, blew up, and it injured the king severely, and the king himself succumbed to his injuries. And then his son Islam Shah Suri came to power, and then the Suri dynasty started to crumble. It started to deteriorate because of internal fighting, civil war between the Suri clans, and Humayun, who was sitting in Persia waiting for his opportunity to come back. He took his opportunity. He saw the Suris were fighting each other. He, with the help of the Persians, came back to take power in India again. And he successfully did that. He removed the Suris. The Suris were completely removed from power. And lo and behold, the Mughals returned to India, this time again ruled by Humayun. Humayun was only back for a few months when he was descending from his library in Delhi. He was very fond of books and collecting manuscripts. He was in his library while he was descending from his library, and he fell from staircase, and he died as a result. He succumbed to his injuries, and he died. So now the burden of power, the burden of ruling India, such a powerful place, such a rich place, the burden fell on the shoulders of his young son called Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, the famous Akbar the Great. Akbar was a very, very interesting character for a number of reasons. Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar came to power in the year 1556. Humayun came back from Persia. He took India in 1555, and he only ruled for a few months when he died, having fallen from his library. And then his son, who was a teenager at the time, according to some reports, he was 13 years old when he was put on the throne. So obviously, this young man, who had already lived a life of turmoil, running with his father and staying in exile, at times being captured and taken as a hostage. Akbar, he had a very, very troubled childhood. So he could not study because he was on the run with his father continuously. He could not study. So Akbar is known to have been, when it comes to reading and writing and learning, he was not learned. He was, some people call him illiterate. I wouldn't call him illiterate, but he was unlearned, unlettered, to use the right term. He was unlettered. So at 13, he came to power. His generals ruled on his behalf, and they helped him out. And he was under the influence of his foster mother called Maham Anag. This was a lady who had breastfed him, and she also had another son called Adam Khan. So Akbar grew up under the influence of his foster mother and a few of his generals and advisors. But he realized that he was simply a puppet, and other people were taking advantage of his power, and he was playing into the hands of other people. Again, the long story short, he took back power for himself, and he kind of got rid of all these people around him who were using him. So Akbar became a very assertive ruler. He became a very creative ruler. Initially, he had deep interest in Islam. So if you pick up Akbar's coin, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, who was a grandson of Muhammad Babur, he initially, as a young man, he had deep interest in Islam. He was very much into Islam. At times, he would go and clean mosques. Basically, he would go and wipe the floor of mosques. He would pick up the slippers of the ulama and he would put them in front of the shuyukh out of respect and dignifying them. But as he grew older, he became more and more haughty. He became more and more rebellious towards religion. And he started to basically go away from the religion of Islam. He started to do his own thing. He didn't want to follow the ulama and the guidance, partly because of the ulama at the time as well, because the ulama were not, unfortunately, very wise people. I'm saying most ulama, not all, because there were some good ulama, but they didn't have access to the emperor. Those who had the access were definitely not good ulama, unfortunately. Some of them were outrightly evil. Some of them were simply there to make money, to fill their pockets, and they wanted to take advantage of this closeness they had with the emperor. So the emperor established in 1570, having come to power for nearly 20 years, he established this place called Ibadat Khana, where he would hold debates among scholars from different faiths. So there would be Hindus, Hindu philosophers sitting there. There would be Muslim intellectuals, some mulhideen, like unorthodox thinkers and other orthodox scholars. And then there would be a Christian thinker sitting there at times. There would be, let's say, a Jain monk sitting there. They would all be debating each other. And Akbar, being an illiterate man, not having the ability to sift through the sophisticated arguments they would use against each other, he didn't have the ability to really assess that information. And he had assumed that these scholars of my time, the Muslim scholars, are the best scholars in the world. And he was, of course, wrong, because the lot he had in his court was the worst of all. Who says so? Actually, one of the scholars who was inside the court, his name was Abdul Qadir, Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni, who was an eyewitness to all of this. He explains as to why Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, who later on apostatized from Islam, why did he apostatize? Why did he leave Islam? A Mughal emperor, such a powerful man, and he expanded the Mughal territory significantly. What was left behind by his father and his grandfather was large enough, but not, the territory he himself later conquered when it comes to Western India and as far as East. He took a lot of land in India, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. But with that power came a lot of influence from other people. Advisors really messed him up, as they say in our language today. They really, really corrupted his mind and his thinking. So he became very, very reluctant towards Islam. So he started to go with, he started to persecute ulama, authentic ulama, good ulama, people who were honorable and sincere. They were not from his court. So Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni, who was one of those people present in the court of Akbar, he writes about all of these debates that took place. And he writes that these ulama, these Muslim ulama, who were mostly there for money and influence and fame and to get close to the emperor, they were not sincere people. They started to abuse each other in front of the emperor. While they were debating with each other, they would abuse each other. They would throw abusive terms against each other. So Akbar, having seen this behavior, he became very, very, very put off. Not only of these ulama, but Islam altogether. Again, cut the long story short, Akbar announced his apostasy, and he announced a new religion, which he came to lead himself. He became the head of the church, his own church. And what was his religion called? It was called Deen-e Ilahi. Deen-e Ilahi. Sounds Islamic, but it was anything but Islamic, basically. It was a completely, concocted system. It was a philosophy he himself came up with, and there was an advisor with him called Abul Fadl. Abul Fadl was again a heretic who was advising Akbar on many of these matters. He was a very learned man, no doubt. He was a very, very learned man, Abul Fadl. There were two brothers, Abul Fazl and Faizi. Faizi was a poet. Abul Fazl was again an intellectual, a philosopher, a thinker, and he really, really, really drove Akbar away from Islam. And made Akbar think that he had some sort of divine powers. So Akbar, in not so many words, himself claimed divinity. This could be seen on his coin. Okay, so if you pick up Akbar's coins from the latter part of his reign, you will see terms like Jalla Jalalahu, from his name Jalaluddin. So Akbar's name was Jalaluddin. From his name, the term Jalla Jalalahu can be found on his coins, basically signifying or highlighting the fact that he may be somehow, A'udhu Billah, divine, right? On the other side of the coins, we will see Allahu Akbar. We will see the terms Allahu Akbar, right? Allah is the greatest. So these were some insinuations on the coins he was putting for people to believe some sort of divinity in him, right? Of course, the ulama rejected him, and they rejected his Deen Ilahi, and they declared takfir against him as well. And a lot of the ulama, they would call him Dalaluddin Akbar, not Jalaluddin Akbar. Rather, he was called Dalaluddin Akbar. Basically, in other words, he is the misguidance of Deen, not the glory of the Deen, rather the misguidance of the Deen, and the biggest disbeliever. Basically, this is what the term means, actually. So the ulama used these kind of derogatory terms, and many ulama during his reign were persecuted, and Muslim empire or the Muslim civilization in India was shaken to the core. Now, this is one of the reasons why Muhammad Akbar, or Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, was so loved by the anti-Islamic establishments in India at that time. And this is why he is loved so much by some anti-Islam or Islamophobic entities in India today. Why do they love Akbar? Because Akbar was himself anti-Islam in many, many forms. In many, many ways, he was anti-Islam. He was killing ulama, he was persecuting ulama. He didn't want Orthodox Islam to take hold of Indian affairs as far as the Muslims are concerned. He didn't want them to follow Islam. So he was very much loved by anti-Muslim establishments in India at the time. And to this day, you know, there is a funny anecdote which I would like to very quickly narrate. When Pakistan became an independent state in 1947, when after the colonial rule of India for nearly 150 years, two countries came about as a result, India and Pakistan. East and West Pakistan put together was Pakistan, and India in the middle was another secular state which was created by the British colonial establishment. So Lord Mountbatten, who was the Viceroy of India, appointed by, of course, King George VI at the time, to send, he was sent basically to partition India and speed the process. So Mountbatten came to India. So when the inauguration speech was happening in Pakistan, in Karachi, in the city of Karachi, Mountbatten was present on the 15th of August. When Mountbatten, he delivered a speech for the then Governor General of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the very founder of Pakistan himself. So Mountbatten, in his speech, he advised the Muslims of Pakistan at the time to follow Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. Why? Because he was an epitome of tolerance. This is the image that was portrayed by colonial thinkers and historians at the time. This was the image of Akbar they were putting forward, that he was a tolerant man because he hated Islam, because he wanted to do away with Islam. So that's why he has to be tolerant, right? So he said, this tolerance, the Muslims of Pakistan must follow. Jinnah came back to deliver his speech. And in his speech, he responded by saying that why do we need to follow Akbar when we have Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as our model? We have him. The tolerance you're talking about was practiced by the Prophet centuries before Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar came to power in India. So we have a greater model, in other words. So this image of Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar as a beacon of light and tolerance and justice and all that is basically a doing of the colonial historians writing in the 19th century. to do away with the Islamic movement of India at the time, to suppress it intellectually. They basically gave rise to these made-up heroes of Islam, people like Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, but he was anything but uh, a Muslim. So he died in 1605, having governed for nearly 50 years, a long, powerful reign. Some people even call it the golden age of the Mughal Empire. Okay, Akbar died. And when it comes to tolerance, he was anything but tolerant. He dealt with his opponents just like any other Mughal king would deal with his opponents. So Akbar was no different to any other Mughal king. He did what had to be done for pragmatic reasons at the time. So he was no different. So when he's portrayed as a beacon of light and tolerance in today's Indian literature, uh, pumped or pushed by the current BJP government, it doesn't make sense to historians. Historians don't see things like that, right? Moving on, Akbar was succeeded by one of his sons called Jahangir, who governed for another about um, 27 years. He governed for nearly 27 years and then came to power his son Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan was a very powerful emperor. Shah Jahan governed from basically 1627 to 1656. Shah Jahan governed from 1627. When Jahangir died, Shah Jahan's father died. Uh, he came to power in 1627. So the time of Shah Jahan, these nearly 30 years, are known as the golden age of the Mughal Empire. Shah Jahan was very much inclined towards Islam. Shah Jahan's father, Jahangir, who was Akbar's son, was also a semi-practicing Muslim. He would very often drink and use opium, and he was womanizing very often. But Shah Jahan was more inclined towards Islam, and he governed effectively for 30 years, and he conquered many territories within India that were not conquered previously. He had 4 sons. Shah Jahan had 4 sons. So now, brothers and sisters, Mughal period, I want to very quickly mention, I should have mentioned this earlier. Mughal period is divided into 2 parts. The rise part, the rise of the Mughal Empire, or the peak of the Mughal Empire, and the decline of the Mughal Empire. Okay, the rise part lasted nearly 150 years. For 150 years, Mughal emperors, one after another, governed somewhat effectively and had a very, very prosperous India under them. But after the year 1707, the Mughals went into a very, very sharp decline. Why that happened, I will quickly explain to you why that happened in India. Um, so after Shah Jahan, his 4 sons came to fight each other. So I can talk about the reign of Shah Jahan. By the way, very quickly, I want to mention a few of his achievements. During the reign of Shah Jahan, the Mughal Empire went through a renaissance. It went through a lot of improvement in culture, economics, uh, uh, cross-religion interactions. Muslim philosophers debated Hindu thinkers were producing works of um, high magnitude. Many Sanskrit works were written. There is one book in particular I would very strongly recommend. It is by Audrey Trusk. Audrey Trusk is a great scholar of Mughal history, and she has been going through a lot of trouble recently, having written books objectively about the Mughal history. She faced a lot of criticism and attacks on social media from the BJP or the current Indian government supporters on Twitter and elsewhere. She was attacked for writing history objectively. So historians writing in India objectively face a lot of backlash, whether they are Western historians or Indian historians. If they write history as it is not accepted by the current government for some reason. And this is another question. I don't want to indulge in the politics, but Audrey Trusk's plight is there for everyone to see. If you read her work, her recent work, she has produced another book whereby she talks about how Sanskrit sources paint the Muslim rule. Sanskrit is the religious language of Hindus, and many Sanskrit authors had written in their own language talking about the Muslim rule, and she has written a book on this. Recently, she published it. I don't remember the title of the book exactly, but you can find it. Audrey Trusk is the author, right? So Aurangzeb, basically, before I get to Aurangzeb, I want to talk about Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan was a very interesting character. So he governed from 1627 to 1656, nearly 30 years, right? You could say 29 years to be precise. Uh, so Shah Jahan, in these 30 years, nearly 30 years, he made many reforms, economically speaking. He did a lot of good work. And interestingly enough, he was the man who built the famous Taj Mahal. Uh, Taj Mahal is basically seen as a symbol of love in the world. You know, a love from one man for his wife, basically. And there's no doubt Shah Jahan loved his wife Mumtaz Mahal dearly. He loved her more than life, basically, right? And there is a reason for that because she went through a lot of sacrifices with him. She gave him a lot of children. Shah Jahan had, if I'm not mistaken, nearly 13 children with Mumtaz Mahal, and she died giving birth to the last child. And she went through a lot of trouble, a lot of adventures, a lot of um, um, problems when Shah Jahan himself was a fugitive running away from his father. Shah Jahan had rebelled against his father, like Jahangir had rebelled against Akbar, his father, and Akbar was going through a lot of trouble with his son. So this was a common Mughal tradition when a son rebels against the father and then he makes up with the father, or maybe gets killed by the father, right? So Shah Jahan had rebelled against his father, Jahangir, and for some years, Shah Jahan was on the run within India in remote territories with his followers and his wife. So his wife went through a lot with a lot. So he was in madly in love with his wife Mumtaz Mahal. When she died, Shah Jahan was absolutely devastated. He had lost any taste for life. He had lost any interest in life. And it is said that he spent long period in seclusion, alone, sitting alone and possibly missing his wife. So, as a token of his love, as a symbol of his love, he built this magnificent structure, which people from all around the world come to see in India, in the city of Agra, called the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal, basically, literally translated, it means the crown palace, the crown palace. This is where Mumtaz Mahal, the beloved wife of Shah Jahan, was buried. Okay, so that was one of his achievements, which he gave to India, which is cherished very much to this day, right? So after Shah Jahan came to power, his son Aurangzeb. But how did Aurangzeb come to power? Is a very good question. Aurangzeb, to put it in simple terms, was the most Islamic of Mughal kings. Aurangzeb, uh, without any hesitation, I would like to say, was the most Islamically observant, Islamically practicing king among the Mughal emperors. There were, again, as I stated earlier, there were other Mughal emperors who had interest in Islam as their faith, as their religion, the religion of their ancestors. They had interest in Islam, but their dedication to Islam, at times was nominal. They only did Islam for pragmatic reasons to make the ulama happy. But Aurangzeb was genuinely a Muslim at heart. He was a Muslim at heart. Okay. Now, the history of Aurangzeb is far too long for me to address in this short lecture, which is again an introduction. I would like you to go and watch my lecture on Aurangzeb on my YouTube channel. You can find the lecture. It's a long lecture on Aurangzeb alone, and you will find it to be fascinating. It's on my YouTube channel. If you put Aurangzeb by Adnan Rashid in YouTube, you will find the lecture. Okay. There is also another video I would like to recommend very quickly, is my book recommendation on Mughal history. If you write Adnan Rashid Mughal history book recommendation on YouTube, you will find that video as well. So you can go and watch that video for an extensive book recommendation on the Mughal history. So please do watch that particular video on Mughal history, where I'm recommending books. So Shah Jahan became ill in 1656. Shah Jahan became ill, and there were four sons. Shah Jahan had four sons, and the Mughals, they had this tradition of giving power to their sons to rule provinces. For example, Shah Jahan had followed the same tradition he had inherited from his ancestors, and Shah Jahan appointed his sons to rule different territories. For example, one of his sons, called uh, Shah Shuja, was given Bengal, the region of Bengal in eastern India. Then Aurangzeb was given the leadership of Deccan, the south of India or southern India. Then there was Murad Bakhsh, who was another son of Shah Jahan, who was given the territory of Gujarat, the province of Gujarat. And Dara Shakoo, the eldest son, Shah Jahan kept him very close to himself at the court, because he wanted Dara Shakoo to come to power after he died. And this was a mistake on Shah Jahan's part. The man he kept close to himself to keep him at court, to be close to the politics of the court, was the most incompetent in battle. And the man he had thrown away, and the man he disliked, or the son he disliked, didn't want him to come to power, was the one who was battle hardened, and that was Aurangzeb. Cut the long story short, in 1656, a rumor spread that Shah Jahan has died, because there was a Mughal tradition of appearing on the gallery every single day. The Mughal emperor would rise on the day, and after sunset, he would appear on the gallery for people to see him in the capital, either in Delhi or Agra. He would come to the gallery for people to see him, and this would be called darshan. This practice was called darshan, basically beholding the emperor. Beholding the emperor. Emperor is there on the gallery. People would gather in large crowds to look at the emperor and pray for him. So emperor did not appear for some days. And when he did not appear for some days, Shah Jahan, who was ill at the time, hadn't died, people assumed that he is dead. And the rumor spread. And when the rumor spread, all the four sons of Shah Jahan, actually three sons who were distant, who were away, who were very far from the center of power, which was in Delhi and Agra. The three of them, they had realized that the father is dead, who was actually not dead, because Dara Shakoo, who was at the court, the eldest son who was at the court, knew the father is not dead, but he wanted to prevent any alarm. But the damage was done. Aurangzeb had heard the father has died. Murad Bakhsh had heard the father has died. The emperor is dead. So did Shah Shuja. So all three of them had to fight it out. There was a principle, an agreed principle among Mughal princes who were establishments within themselves. Each Mughal prince was ruling territories as large as countries today, for example. For example, these Mughal princes were very powerful. They had their own states, they had their own governors, they had their own military generals, they had their own armies. Some of them employed close to 50,000 people. This is how big the system. Can you imagine a prince who has a staff of 50,000 people running his army, his administration, his finances, uh, managing his domain? So these were very, very, very ultra powerful Mughal princes. And each and every single one of them wanted to become the king. So this was this Mughal tradition, or Turkic tradition rather, which was brought into India that every prince has to fight it out, and the strongest would come to power. This is how simple it was. So Mughal princes knew that once the emperor dies, chaos will follow, and whoever wins the war, not the battle necessarily, will become the next emperor. So there was this understood slogan or understood principle between the Mughal princes, and it goes as follows in the Persian language: Ya takht, ya tabut. Basically, it's either the throne or the box as in coffin, right? So it's either the throne or the coffin. There's nothing less we would want. Why? Because they knew if they lose the battle, they would be killed anyway. So they would rather die in battle, right? Again, long story short, after Shah Jahan's death was announced falsely or inaccurately as an error, these three princes mobilized their armies towards the capital, right? And I want to cut the long story short. The victorious prince among them was Aurangzeb Alamgir, the most disliked son by Shah Jahan. Um, and Shah Jahan became a prisoner of Aurangzeb. Shah Jahan wanted Aurangzeb dead, and Shah Jahan loved Dara Shikoh, the eldest son, uh, so much that he wanted him to be the emperor. But Dara Shikoh, who may be a scholar, who may be a thinker, a poet, but was not a good warrior. He tried to win the war of succession. He had huge support because the emperor's backing, um, but he lost the war against Aurangzeb, and so did other brothers. So Murad Baksh was killed by Aurangzeb, so was Dara Shikoh. After a trial in Delhi, he was put on trial for treason and other things, and he was killed. And Shah Shuja, he basically left India to Burma, and it is thought that he died in Burma or Myanmar at that time, Burmese territory. So Aurangzeb became the ruler. Aurangzeb was a very religious man. He was inclined to religion. He was in love with Islam, and that's why the ulama backed him. They didn't want Dara Shikoh to come to power because Dara Shikoh was seen another individual who had interest in Hindu philosophy, and he wanted to basically disturb the order of Islam in India. So they didn't want another Akbar situation in India. Remember, I talked about Akbar, who initiated his own religion. So the ulama were very nervous about Dara Shikoh. They didn't want him to come to power. Hence, they backed Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb was the right man for them. And the details, again, are far too many for me to go through. For that, you will have to read Audrey Trusk's book on Aurangzeb. Audrey Trusk, whom I have mentioned earlier, has written another book titled The Life of Aurangzeb. You must study that book, uh, Aurangzeb by Audrey Trusk, a very interesting introduction of Aurangzeb's history. So Aurangzeb memorized the Quran having become the emperor. Can you believe it? Someone who becomes an emperor at the age of 40 and he starts memorizing the Quran. So at the age of 40, Aurangzeb memorized the Quran. He was known for his deep interest in Islamic sciences. He surrounded himself by the ulama. He also ordered for a great compendium to be compiled uh, for the Muslim law, or the Hanafi fiqh in particular, and his collection made in his name or by his behest by the ulama was called Al-Fatawa, Al-Fatawa al-Alamgiriya, basically also known as Al-Fatawa al-Hindiya, okay, the Indian jurisprudence or Indian compendium, for example, for that matter, or the compendium of Emperor Alamgir. Okay, so this is the largest collection of Hanafi jurisprudence in the world, which was, of course, sanctioned or patronized by Aurangzeb Alamgir. Aurangzeb was a very simple man who governed for the next 50 years, nearly 50 years, and he lived a very long life. He died in 1707, um, nearly 89 years old or nearly 90 years old, and his reign was the richest period in Indian history. This has been confirmed by historians. Aurangzeb Alamgir, who is very much maligned by, again, the current Indian government as a policy. There are two individuals
from the Muslim history who are especially maligned, if not more. Two in particular, if not more. Of course, there are more Muslim heroes of the past who are definitely maligned by the current Indian government, and schools and colleges and universities are being pressurized into demonizing these figures from Indian history. Two in particular receive special treatment. One is Aurangzeb Alamgir, and the other is Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan, who also governed parts of southern India in the 18th century, and that's another topic. Maybe perhaps we can do another lecture on Tipu Sultan specifically in the future. I have been speaking for nearly 1 hour, so I want to quickly summarize the lecture and conclude the lecture so that you can ask your questions, inshallah. Very, very quickly, I want to do that. So Aurangzeb Alamgir was one of the most powerful emperors who ruled India. He was the most Islamic of emperors, and he was one of the most, or he is one of the most controversial figures in Indian history, not because he himself was, any different to any other Mughal king, but he is most controversial because the British colonial historians painted him as a villain. So did the Indian nationalist authors later on, and the current Indian government holds him as a villain. Okay, so why is that the case? Because he was the most Islamic Mughal king, and because the current Indian government is promoting dislike of Islam as a policy, anyone who was attached to Islam in Indian history has to be maligned at the same time, right? So Aurangzeb Alamgir had many, many good qualities. He's the man who built the famous, the large, the humongous Badshahi Mosque in Lahore. So if you use the old Grand Trunk Road to enter Lahore, you will see the Badshahi Mosque as the first monument that hits your eyes. It is a spectacle. It is a spectacle to behold. It is a masterpiece of Mughal art. It is absolutely magnificent. I strongly recommend anyone visiting Pakistan anytime soon in the future, you must visit Lahore to see the Badshahi Mosque built by Aurangzeb Alamgir. It was completed in 1674 by this venerable emperor. He used to write the Quran in his own hand. He was a calligrapher. He was a poet. He was an intellectual. He took justice very seriously. When he saw wrong done anywhere during his reign, he took matters into his hands personally. He got the wrongs done right personally. At the same time, people accuse him of bigotry. He was somehow against Hindus. He's accused of that. But scholars have clarified that he employed more Hindus in his state than all of the Mughal emperors put together before him. I repeat, Aurangzeb employed more Hindus in his military, in his administration, in his state apparatus, generally speaking, than all of the Mughal emperors put together before him, including Shah Jahan, his father, his grandfather Jahangir, his great-grandfather Akbar, Humayun, and Babur. All of them put together, they employed less Hindus in the state apparatus than Aurangzeb did. So why is he maligned as a bigot? In fact, scholars have estimated that 33% of his employers in the state apparatus were Hindus. 33%. Some of his best generals were Hindus. So he fought against the Marathas. He spent 25 years of his life in southern India fighting the Marathas, who were rebels, devastating the land, devastating the country. He fought against them. Shivaji, who is a hero of the Hindu nationalist movement today in India, was a rebel who fought against him. But he is given a Hindu image for the wrong reasons in India today. Shivaji was not fighting for Hinduism necessarily because he had Muslim generals in his army. He was working with the Muslims. So it was a bit of a mixture, just like Reconquista in Spain. It was not necessarily a war of religion, rather it was a land grabbing enterprise. Likewise in India, in the 17th century, it was a land grabbing enterprise as far as the Marathas are concerned. They were troubling the Mughals because they wanted the Mughals out of their territory. That's what it was. And they were using Muslims where they could. They were using Hindus, Marathas, and the Rajputs were fighting against the Marathas, both of whom are Hindus. Okay, the Rajputs were siding with the Mughals, and while the Marathas were against the Mughals. So again, it's a long history. Aurangzeb spent 25 years of his life, the last 25 years of his life in southern India. He died there and he was buried in the city of Aurangabad. And he, as far as he was alive, uh, when he was alive, India was the most powerful country in the world, militarily and economically. 24% of global GDP was in India. I repeat again, 24% of the global GDP was in India. And when the British left India in the 1940s, the GDP of India was 4% of global, basically, when we look at the global economy at that time. 4%, from 24% to 4%. So why do people claim that the British colonial period was good for India and Mughal period was not? If anything, the Mughal period took India to heights it had never seen before, culturally, educationally, when it comes to military strength and economically, you name it. The Mughals made India a big power. The Mughals made India India. India was never united before for such a long time. Under one dynasty. There were individuals, there were emperors like Ashoka had conquered a lot of India, no doubt. Okay, but it was never united for a long period. But under the Mughals, India took identity for itself. It claimed identity. It united itself, right? So after Aurangzeb's death, my brothers and sisters, came the decline of the Mughal Empire. 1707, when Mughal Empire started to decline. So while in 150 years, we saw about 6 emperors on the throne. Let's say from 1526 up to 1707, we had Babur, we had Humayun, we had Akbar, we had Jahangir, we had Shah Jahan, and we had Aurangzeb. 6 emperors for 150 years. But after the death of Aurangzeb, within the next 12 years, 5 emperors, if not more, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, more than 5 emperors sat on the Mughal throne. In the next 50 years, there were 13 emperors who sat on the Mughal throne. From 1707 to, let's say, 1757, 13 emperors sat on the Mughal throne. And who took advantage of this chaos? Many regional and foreign powers. For example, the Marathas from the south, who were a raiding entity, they would come into the north and raid the north and rape and pillage and go back. They were not interested in forming an empire initially when they started. The Sikhs in the Punjab region, they rose. Then the British, who were outsiders, foreigners, the East India Company, who came for trading, they saw an opportunity and they started to scavenge for land like other local powers were doing. And from the ashes of the Mughal Empire rose the British Empire that started to take the land after the 1750s, gradually from the Mughals. And the Mughals lost their political, military, economic influence in India forever. And the British, by the year 1800, managed to take large territories within India. Large. So it took nearly 50 years for the British East India Company to take much of Mughal India from the hands, partially from the hands of the Mughals, and then from the hands of the Marathas, who had taken a lot of territory from the Mughals. So the Mughals eventually became nominal rulers. They became puppet rulers. The British started to appoint emperors just as just like a showpiece, basically, a decoration piece. The Mughals were simply decoration pieces. So the court of Delhi was simply confined to Delhi. The rest of the power came into the hands of the British, and the British started to exert power all over India, having defeated all major local powers, like, for example, Tipu Sultan in Mysore. He was defeated. The Nizam of Deccan, of Hyderabad, was neutralized by the British, politically speaking. And then the Marathas were defeated in 1803 decisively. So the the British came to govern the city of Delhi. So it was in the first time, let's say, in 600 years, when a foreign power came to rule the city of Delhi after the Muslims had ruled it for nearly 6 centuries, for 600 years. And cut the long story short, in 1857, a mutiny took place against the British rule, and the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was appointed as the leader. The mutiny was lost, the battle or the war was lost. The British came back to power and they deposed the last nominal Mughal emperor and exiled him to Burma, where he died in poverty. This was a very sad end of the Mughal Empire. Okay. Now, there is so much I could talk about when it comes to Mughal intellectual history and Mughal contribution to knowledge, arts. Mughal art is some of the best art in the world. Mughals produced manuscripts, Islamic and otherwise, on a grand scale. India became a power hub. India became a center of learning, generally speaking, all over India under the Mughals, right? There were poets born in India during the Mughal period. There were scholars, there were theologians, there were philosophers, thinkers. India was so powerful and prosperous that Europeans were coming into India to trade, like the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. The French came to try their fortune in India. The Portuguese had taken Goa from the Mughals and kept it for a very long time, right? So India was filled with gold and diamonds and precious gems and manufacture. India was the largest manufacturer in the world from the Roman period onwards. Even the Roman sources mention India, the subcontinent, as the supplier of cloth, good quality cloth. And that was stopped by the East India Company later on, the colonial powers, so that their cloth produced in Europe or produced in Britain in particular could be sold. One book I strongly recommend on this topic is by Shashi Tharoor. He's an Indian intellectual, Indian author, and his book is titled The Dark Empire or something like that, The Dark Empire. Okay, he talks about the colonial period in India and how India was bled dry, or how India as a continent or as a subcontinent, as a territory, was exploited by foreign powers for their own gain, and how foreign powers to this day continue to take benefit from that wealth looted from India. Another book by William Dalrymple is highly recommended. It is titled The Anarchy. The Anarchy is another book which talks about the rise of the East India Company in India, how this colonial power came about, and how a trading company got its hands on power in India and then later on drained India dry to an extent that India now is a struggling economy, like with Pakistan and Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a very good upcoming economy, of course. Bangladesh in the last 10 years or maybe 20 years has made good progress. But India and Pakistan as economies are struggling to this day as a result of colonial looting and polluting and abusing and exploitation and all that. My brothers and sisters, I will stop here. I have spoken for more than I was due to speak. I do apologize. The topic is absolutely mind-blowing. It's fascinating. And wallahi, I don't have the time. Each and every single point I mentioned, my brothers and sisters, is a lecture in itself. I need to do a long series on the Mughals and their achievements and what they did for India and how great their dynasty was and what were the shortcomings they had. All of these things need to be talked about. But in a short lecture like this, I'm sorry, I apologize. I will take your questions now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Thank you, Sheikh Adnan. That was very fascinating, full of facts and interesting stories. So if people have questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask or put it in the chat and I can read it out loud.
I think there were many comments that came through. So if there are any questions in the comments, we can take them first, inshallah, and then let people ask the question.
Yeah, Sheikh, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. MashaAllah, I learned a lot. I had a question on you mentioned that Akbar had sort of created his own religion sort of during his reign. Is there any similarities between that faith and then the sort of New World Baha'i faith that's also sort of like taking from a bunch of different past cultures and religions?
To be fair, I'm not too aware of the Baha'i faith. I haven't read on it yet, so I wouldn't be able to comment on what the similarities are between Deen Ilahi and Baha'i faith. But there is no doubt that Deen Ilahi was a mixture of different philosophies Akbar had adopted, and he came up with this new idea, and he started to basically practice it himself. Although he didn't enforce this so-called religion on his courtiers, and in fact, many of his followers in the court were very reluctant to even consider it. They knew it's a false religion. Akbar is just he's lost his mind, and that's why Akbar never enforced this religion on people or even his courtiers. He had some die-hard followers who ended up following it. Uh, Scholars put the number to about 18 people who ended up following his religion. So, in other words, it was a failure, and it died with him. When Akbar died, Deen Ilahi went with him, and the Ilahi months were used on the coins, on Mughal coins later on the coins of Jahangir, and because Akbar came up with his own calendar, the Ilahi calendar, he introduced his new calendar, replacing the Islamic calendar. So these months were used for practical reasons because these months had been used in India for a very long time, for nearly, let's say, 25 to 30 years. So it wasn't easy to remove an already existing system immediately. So for that reason, for the reasons of practicality, the Mughals later on, like Jahangir and Shah Jahan, also used these months on their coins and on correspondence, in correspondences. But later on, when Aurangzeb came to power, he re-Islamified India to what India came to be later on. And when I say re-Islamified India, I don't mean he forced Hindus into Islam. This is another huge lie against Aurangzeb, that he was forcing Hindus to accept Islam. How can he force his own general who's fighting for him against other Hindu power like the Marathas in the south? They were Rajputs. Rajputs are Hindus, and Aurangzeb had them as generals in his military. So how do you force them to accept Islam? This is ridiculous. The claims like that are absolutely ridiculous, and they're based upon ignorance. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much for everything that you shared. I had like a couple of questions. So it seems like the most, I guess, like besides Aurangzeb, most of the Mughal emperors were not that religious, perhaps. Like, I mean, definitely they're like Akbar for sure wasn't, but like it seems like they weren't that religious. So first of all, how were who gave the ulama power? Because it seems like they had influence on the emperors. And second, how did the majority of the people of India become pretty, like, how did they accept Islam if the Mughals themselves were not that religious?
Okay, very good question. Before I forget, I would like to start with recommending a book on this very topic, The Ulama and Politics. There's a book authored by I.H. Qureshi. I.H. Qureshi, who was a Pakistani scholar, historian, who has produced a fascinating work on this very topic, how the ulama and politics work together. So he talks about a lot of history in this book. And the title is The Ulama and the Politics by I.H. Qureshi. Qureshi is spelled with Qureshi, right? So when it comes to the Islam of the Mughal emperors, they were as Muslim as an emperor could be at the time. Okay, they were not. I wouldn't say they were like the awliya of Allah, praying day and night, praying tahajjud, and not indulging in any pastimes like music and
drinking wine and having dance parties, whatever that meant at the time, right? They were all involved in this. This was part of the culture, right? Aurangzeb was an exception. But when it comes to having ghira for Islam, or having, let's say, a desire to be Muslim and to defend Islam, to declare Islam to be a public faith, the Mughals were all Islamic in that sense. If you pick up Babur's coins, for example, it has the Shahada on it, right? La ilaha illallah wahdahu, sorry, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah is in the middle. Then you would have the names of the four caliphs, right? And then on the other side, you would have the mint and the name of the emperor and the date when the coin was minted. So when it comes to Islam as a public religion of their domain, they made no compromise. They made no compromise. Babur, who again himself was a Muslim in the nominal sense. When I say nominal sense, he did pray, no doubt. He did read the Quran, right? But at the same time, he had weaknesses, like any Mughal prince or any Timurid prince at the time had. For example, he used to drink, right? He was into music. So was Humayun. Humayun was using opium, right? I'm pretty sure Akbar also, because Akbar apostatized from Islam, so we don't really need to talk about Islam, his Islam much. But those who did declare themselves to be Muslims, like Jahangir and Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, out of all of them, Aurangzeb was the most observant of Islam as a king. And he lived like a simple man. He did not, he removed all the pomp and the glitter of the Mughal court. Mughals had put traditions in place that if you came to their court, you would have to bow and wave at the emperor 3 times. It was called Cornish, like you have to bow and wave with your hand to pay your respects. Aurangzeb removed all these erroneous practices because they were un-Islamic. Aurangzeb removed music from his court. He didn't want his court to have musicians, basically, right? There's a funny anecdote which is mentioned by one of his biographers. If I'm not mistaken, Saki Mustaid Khan, he mentions that when Aurangzeb was once leaving the palace to go and pray the Jummah at the mosque, he saw a procession of janaza. There was a janaza, there was a funeral, and he stopped, and the people who were carrying the funeral, the dead body, they were making a lot of noise. They were crying loud. So Aurangzeb, out of curiosity, the emperor, he asked, what is going on here? Who are these people? He was told that these are the musicians and they are carrying the janaza of music. So basically they're saying the emperor has killed music. So the emperor, quite humorously, he responded by saying, tell them to bury it deep. Tell them to bury it deep. So this was a funny anecdote which was mentioned by one of Aurangzeb's biographers and even a European source. By the way, Mughal history is studied according to a number of, in light of a number of primary sources as well as secondary sources. So primary sources are vast. There are too many for different reigns. And there are also European travelers who traveled through India at the time. Some of them were Italian, some of them were French. There were English authors who had written, who were eyewitnesses, who wrote about Mughal India. So there is a huge list of books you can find in the book recommendations I have done in my YouTube video titled Book Recommendation on Mughal History. So please do look into that. So Aurangzeb was the most Muslim, Islam observing king. Others were semi-Muslim. When I say semi-Muslim, semi-practicing Muslims. Semi-practicing Muslims. Apart from Akbar, apart from Muhammad Akbar, all of them were semi-practicing Muslims. They had a high regard for Islam. They rated Islam very, very highly. Islam was a very important part of their lives, political and otherwise, and they made it very, very clear. But were they perfect Muslims? Were they great Muslims? Were they fully practicing Muslims? Did they not do anything wrong ever in their lives? Did they have any non-Islamic practices in their courts, in their dealings, or in their daily business? Absolutely not. The answer is absolutely not. They were not Muslim in that sense. There were imperfect Muslims, there were semi-practicing Muslims, but Aurangzeb Alamgir was an exception. Next
Exactly.
question.
I have a question. So you mentioned like the history at the beginning of how Islam first entered India. You know, there was many different episodes of military conquests and conflict, and obviously a lot of it was fueled by search for wealth or land. And eventually there were conflicts between Hindus and Muslims and Hindus and other Hindus. So it's very complicated history. But a lot of right-wing pundits will try to compare colonialism to like the Mughal history or Islamic conquests by saying, oh, you know, colonialism, Europeans weren't the first to colonize these lands. Like before the British, it was the Muslims, and then they'll make that comparison. So how do you respond to that? How would you not let people sort of make a comparison where the Muslims appear equal to British colonialists who
That's
looted
a
the
very
country
good
and so on?
question. That's a very good question, and thank you for that. Thank you for asking that question. This question was recently raised in a discussion by a very famous um, uh, spiritual thinker in India. He's very well known. His name is Sadhguru. Sadhguru has millions of followers in India and beyond. Even in the West, he has many followers, and he's seen as a spiritual guide by many. And he has recently shown Islamophobic tendencies in many of his talks and discussions, possibly to please the current Indian government for pragmatic reasons. He was in a discussion with Shashi Tharoor, whom I mentioned earlier, and he mentioned that the Mughals were like invaders and they came and they devastated like colonial powers. But Shashi Tharoor, he responded by saying that Mughals did not take anything to Central Asia. Whatever they took from India was used in India for the betterment of India. Mughals made India powerful by living here. They became Indian. In fact, the mothers of some of the Mughal kings, emperors were Indian. They were Indian women. If you look at early Mughals like Babur and Humayun, they look Chinese, they look Central Asian, they look very Oriental. When I say Oriental, I mean Chinese looking. But later Mughals, they started to look Indian. They started to have Indian features because their mothers were Indian. So the Mughals, you can say that about Babur. Maybe Babur was an invader, he came from outside. But you cannot say that about later Mughals. Later Mughals were very Indian. They were as Indian as it gets. Of course, they followed the Persian model that was inherited by them. Persian language was not brought by the Mughals. Rather, the Persian language came with Mahmud Ghaznavid in the 11th century, and then it remained with the Delhi Sultanate period, the slave dynasty period. So the Persian language was the language of the court, and the Mughals didn't bring it. Mughals are simply using it because it was already there. So the Mughals were the true sons of the Indian subcontinent. They made India what it is today. And they did not loot, pollute, exploit India and take wealth to foreign bank accounts or started building mansions in Bahamas or let's say in exotic islands in the Caribbean Sea, or they weren't like these drug dealers or colonial administrators like slaveholders in the 19th century and in the 18th century who had plantations, let's say in the Caribbean islands like Jamaica, and they were bringing all this wealth back to Britain, to live lavish lives. Likewise, there were East India Company administrators and workers who would come to India to make a fortune and go back to Britain and make palaces and buy estates there. The Mughals weren't doing that. The Muslim kings weren't doing that, including Tipu Sultan. They were the true sons of their land. They loved the territory they were living in, and they served it to the best of their abilities. If we start talking about their achievements, your minds will be blown away. Believe me. I mean, I wish I could talk more about the technology, the military technology Mughals pioneered in India. There are books written on that, right? How Mughals promoted poetry, how Mughals promoted tolerance for each other, for religions to coexist, how Mughals pioneered, book production, how Mughals pioneered agricultural reforms, how Mughals took care of security situation in India. Mughals were very brutal against criminals. Of course, the colonial powers later on were more organized. They were more modern in that sense. But the Mughals, they had started the process. In fact, the British, when they came to power, they used a lot of administrative reforms left behind by Akbar, who, of course, took these reforms from Sher Shah Suri, who was also a very religious king. Sher Shah Suri, whom I talked about earlier, was a highly religious king, and he left behind many, many reforms which Akbar adopted and took full advantage of. And then later on, the British adopted a lot of those reforms into the system. And they last to this day. A lot of those reforms brought by the Muslims, they last to this day in India and in Pakistan. You can see the remnants, you can see the signs of all that history even today. So Mughals did not loot the Indian subcontinent and take the wealth somewhere else to make mansions and palaces somewhere else. Rather, they used everything in India, and they caused all territories and all people to flourish. Of course, there was no utopia. I'm not saying Mughals were perfect. They came from the heavens. They were angels, and there were pearls and diamonds dripping from their hair. Okay, when they sneezed, there was gold all over the place. I'm not saying that. I'm saying Mughals were as human as any other kings governing India at the time, right? But they were, when it comes to the contribution, they made India the most powerful entity in the world, militarily and economically, definitely. There's no doubt about it. I believe Mughals were possibly more powerful than the Ottomans were, militarily speaking, because Mughals were richer. Mughals were richer than the Ottomans. I hope that answers your question. But they were not necessarily more Islamic than the Ottomans. The Ottoman emperors, with all their weaknesses, with all their hanky-panky and, all the problems they had, personal and otherwise, they were definitely more Islamically inclined than the Mughals were, of course, with the exception of Aurangzeb Alamgir.
I had a quick question. My parents grew up in India during Indira Gandhi's Congress government, and they're fed some of the similar state narratives about Aurangzeb, and in stark contrast to Akbar about Sulikul, Ibadat Khana, Din-e-Ilahi, versus Aurangzeb being the sort of almost extremist jihadi figure. And I imagine that's gotten a lot worse since the BJP's government. I'm wondering, after having taken a class with Munis Farooqi and read Audrey Trusch's book, if there's any sort of grain of truth to the accusations that are leveled against Aurangzeb, or if it's all just sort of concocted by British colonial governments or the modern post-independence Indian state.
Sorry, your question was, what was your question?
Yeah. Is there any sort of grain of truth to the sort of accusations of mass conversions or forced?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There is, what these propagandists, Islamophobic propagandists who are working hard today in India, unfortunately promoting a lot of mistrust and dividing communities along communal lines, and what these people do is they use some truth with a lot of lies. So what they will do is they'll take one incident and they'll put their own spin on it. Historians don't agree with them. Historians don't work like that. If you pick up any serious historian and read about these Mughal emperors, you will be fascinated, not because these were perfect characters, rather, you will realize how many lies that have been fed to people in India, the masses. Okay, how many lies have been told against some of these great rulers? I mean, without praising them too much, or with all the imperfections, albeit with a lot of their imperfections, they did great things for the continent. Okay, no one is perfect, right? So these narratives are specifically created to cause political turmoil, to score specific political points, right?
and it's all politics, right? Sometimes people read the current events into history and start to read, for example, people start to equate Aurangzeb with ISIS, but there was no comparison. Imagine ISIS having a Hindu general. This is my answer. This is how you make these people look stupid. State historic facts. Imagine ISIS having a Hindu finance minister. Can you imagine that, brothers and sisters? Can you imagine ISIS corresponding with Hindu intellectuals and having friendly discussions? So where is ISIS in Aurangzeb? Where is ISIS in Tipu Sultan? So people, these propagandists, these liars, these Islamophobes, you know, to paint, this is why Muslims, this is why these lectures are so important. These talks are so important, so that we can go back to our sources, study them carefully, and see through this facade, see through this propaganda and these lies, and start to educate people. The only cure to this disease of hate and misrepresentation is education. So you mentioned Munis Farooqi. He's an amazing scholar, a very, very good historian. He has written an amazing book, which I have personally read. It is titled The Princes of the Mughal Empire. You must read that book, all of you, brothers and sisters. It's an absolutely fascinating work on how the Mughal princes worked, what their lives were like. How did a Mughal prince live, for example, right? What was his education like? What was his upbringing like? What did he go through? What kind of teachers he had? What kind of military training he went through? What kind of people he hanged around with? What kind of expectations there were from them? So all of these things he discusses in this fascinating book titled The Princes of the Mughal Empire, Munis Farooqi. He's also working on another book on Aurangzeb, which might be forthcoming soon. I don't know when, but he's working on one. I'm aware of that. And Audrey Trush, again, if you read these books by modern historians who are working for academic institutions, you will see light. I'm not saying they're all liars. There are biased historians, no doubt, but majority of them, they give you good information, and it does make sense when you start reading through these works. It will bring a lot of knowledge to you and a lot of understanding to you of history, right? History is not black and white. It's never black and white. There are always nuances one has to consider, right? So all of these things you hear about Aurangzeb and Tipu Sultan and other Muslim figures, most of them are lies, a pack of lies. There's no truth in these things when people claim. And, a lot of these people are guilty of anachronism. Anachronism is basically reading your age into the past, reading your standard, your moral values into the past. They didn't live in your age. They were not dealing with you. They were dealing with a different kind of people. Those people expected different things from their kings and the rulers, and they gave them those things. So it's very important for us to understand that. I hope that answers your question, inshallah. Any more questions?
Okay, if there are no more questions, inshallah, we can wrap up.
I just want to say this was an amazing lecture. Jazakallah. May Allah give you a lot of reward for this. And we would love to hear you more. And how can I do that?
If you go to my YouTube channel, you will see a lot of lectures on Indian history in particular and other history in general. I've talked about many Muslim figures. I've talked about Muslim dynasties and Muslim periods, historically speaking. So you'll find lectures on Islamic Spain. You'll find lectures on Shah Waliullah, Tipu Sultan. You'll find lectures on Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. You will find lectures on history of Islam in India. It's a short introduction with a documentary in a documentary form. So there's a lot on my YouTube channel. If you put my name Adnan Rashid in YouTube, you'll see my channel there. Inshallah.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. And thank you for a beautiful lecture.
You're welcome. I would like to make some final remarks that just remember, keep in mind, brothers and sisters, that as objective students of history, we must not glorify our past in a way that it was a utopia, as if there was nothing wrong with it, right? At the same time, we must not reject or be apologetic about our past to an extent that we don't own our civilization. We are proud of our civilization. Wherever the Muslims went, there was human imperfection, there was human error. But what made the civilization of Islam beautiful from India to Spain is this common theme of beauty in art, beauty in architecture, beauty in books, in literature, in poetry, in all these things. They went everywhere Muslims went, however they went, they took this knowledge, this love for coexistence, this love for tolerance. Of course, it was never perfect. I'm not saying it was ever perfect. I'm saying all of these people were humans. They made human mistakes. They had human weaknesses. At the same time, they took Islam with them, and they made sure that Islam was a beautiful thing for the people of these lands. So Mughals represent the Muslim civilization in somewhat imperfect way. So do the Ayyubids, so do the Mamluks, so do the Murabitun in, let's say, in Spain, the Umayyads in Spain, and the list goes on. The list goes on. The Ilkhanids who became Muslim later on, the Mongols who became Muslims, they were known as the Ilkhanids. So there is a lot to talk about. And you're more than welcome to get in touch with me in the future, inshallah. I would love to deliver more lectures and talks and talk about these things openly, inshallah. Maybe we can start with Tipu Sultan one day, inshallah. He's a fascinating figure. I would strongly recommend a talk on him, inshallah.
That'd be great, inshallah. I'd love to organize that. We have taken up a lot of your time, Sheikh. So thank you very much. If you could end us off with a dua, that'd be
okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for inviting me. May Allah bless you all. May Allah bless you for your patience. And I thank Allah for everything. And I'm not perfect. I am possibly made mistakes, and do forgive my mistakes. So I end with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تجعلنا فتنة للذين كفروا واغفر لنا ربنا إنك أنت العزيز الحكيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
بارك الله فيك. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم